All right, someone was asking about if you could turn the escalator spline system into like for a crane, which you absolutely can. So I just have it hooked up to the up and down arrow, and it goes all the way down, and then you can bring it all the way up. So we're gonna go over that blueprint. I'm not gonna do it from scratch, but what I'm gonna do in this video is just like, I think I'm gonna label this stuff in the blueprint to how to get that to work and explain it as I label things. The first thing outside of that, so I just duplicated the escalator blueprint to start and called one controlled cable. And then I also added in the input section of the project settings, move crane, which I linked to up and down keys on your keyboard, and I put down as +1 on the axis and then up is -1. That just made sense to me. Okay, so a lot of this is actually going to be in the construction script, and then there's going to be one function that we also made for it. So in the construction script on the spline, so let me show here we go. So we still have the spline, we still have the cube. The main difference, and I'll kind of compare this to the escalator, is within the escalator we are making an array. But if you're making a crane, you don't actually need that array. You actually only are going to have two main objects. You're going to have the cable, and then you're going to have the cargo at the bottom of the cable. So in the construction script, so the way I do this is I'm setting a variable, which is the distance along the spline, and we'll use this variable later to move it up and down. The way I set it up is I just have a starting variable, which is the ratio. So you can set that in our blueprint. So if you wanted to start at the bottom or start at the top, you can change the ratio of where it starts, and you can adjust the interpret speed just like the escalator. So we get the spline length, multiply by the ratio, and then we get the distance along spline. And then the two objects we're going to set up. So this one will be setting up the spawning in cargo mesh. And then the next one down here, this will be spawning in the cable. And notice the cable, it just gets, I don't actually set any of the transforms because I need to get the box extents of the cable. So both of them I create a reference to by making a variable. So I just pull that out, promote to variable, and then I just label them as such. But for the cable, we use a set cable length function, which is a function that we made. And it has two variables. So it has the cable reference and then the current spline distance, which in our case is the distance along spline variable that we're setting here. And then the way in which we set up the cable, the object for that, by the way, is just the standard cylinder. So whatever in this place actors, this cylinder here, that's the cylinder we're using, which is just right here. And then to set the length of it, since we want to stretch it out, we are going to set both the location and the scale. For the location, it's going to be, there's this node called get bounds. So component bounds is what that, oh, no, actually. Let's see, get bounds. There we go, get local bounds. And then we just expanded these out. So this is actually going to be from the middle to the outside. So we want to move this up, since if you notice, this object here scales from the center, and we want to move it so it's only on one edge. You could create a new cylinder in like Blender and not worry about this, but I wanted to see if I could do it mathematically, and it's not too hard. You just add that distance, but make sure to multiply that distance by the scale you want to make it. And speaking of which, so this scale, so we'll label this add distance offset for the pivot, because functionally saying we're just changing the pivot, and then we're multiplying the distance by the scale when we need it, and the scale is going to be however like tall this is. So if you look, it says this mesh is 100 by 100 by 100, but instead of hard coding in 100, so this is going to be 50. So if you notice, if we print this out, let's change this to, this will be for the bounds node. If we, let's just compile this, it's printing out 50. So we need to multiply that by 2 to get the full 100. And that we are going to divide by the distance along the spline. And that will give us a multiplier on how much we need to stretch the cylinder to get the full length of the cable. And then for the Y and X values, I just put 0.1, so this cable is somewhat thin. And that gets us our initial setup of this. In terms of the actual functions, you do need to enable input, since this isn't the player. This is kind of a messy way to do it. You probably want to set up like a control system for the crane, or you could even make the crane the player itself, depending on how your game is set up. In terms of the nodes to get the actual crane to move, so we have our axis that we set up in the project settings right there, crane move. So that is right here. And the first thing we're doing is the key pressed at all. So that's the first thing we're checking, is like, okay, let's measure the absolute value of this. And if it needs to be greater than 0 in order to go forward. And then down here we check, okay, is it less than 0? So is it -1? If it is -1, set it to be reversed. So we'll do set to reverse if axis is -1, like that. So then here, let's give ourselves a bit more space so we can actually label things. So then in here, figure out, so this would be interpret to the spline length or 0, depending on if you are reverse or not. So that's what that is doing. So if it's reverse, it's going to try to go to 0, and if it's not, it's just going to try to interpret it down to the end of the spline. And then here, I'm just making sure, hey, is this either at the end of the spline, or is it either, it needs to be less than the length of the spline. Here, we'll label this. Only move things if it does not, if it is less than the spline or and greater than the minimum distance. Okay. So I'm just spell checking. Here we go. Using the wrong than. Okay. So that's what this is doing. So you notice, like, if I bring it all the way to the top, even though I'm holding down the key, it doesn't go any more than that because I don't want it to. So notice if I remove this, let's just check it, it will be able to kind of go past the end of the spline into the crane, which I didn't really like how that looked, so I got the bounds of the cargo and kind of constrained it by how tall the cargo is. And then once this is blurred, so we just set the location of the cargo to the distance along the spline. And then the last function here, we actually get to just what we used here in terms of set cable length. We can just do it again. So update the cable length to the distance of the spline, just like that. So it's not too complicated. You don't need this for loop in the same way the escalator does. So that is for sure a difference. And so this is like the for loop in here. And you also don't need this. This is kind of the returning system for the steps on the escalator to like go back to the top. And obviously you also wouldn't need that on your crane. So a crane is actually a bit simpler of a setup than the escalator. So great question. If y'all have any more questions, feel free to drop them. I love responding directly to things that people are wondering about. And catch you later.